Good morning. Welcome to today's conference. I'm Joyce Coleman, the Executive Director of the Vasculitis Foundation, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We want to thank you and all the speakers, the volunteers, and the VF staff for helping us as we launch the 2021 ACR VF guidelines. Today's agenda is pretty simple. We're going to start here in this room and hear from Dr. Sharon Chung about what are the guidelines, how were they developed, why were they developed, and how they can be used. After Dr. Chung's talk, we will move into breakout rooms where we explore individually by disease what were the recommendations or what are the recommendations, the guidelines for that specific disease. After the breakout rooms, we will come back to this general session room for a talk with Dr. Carol Langford, who will discuss the importance of disseminating the guidelines out to the medical community. I want to thank all of our presenters and moderators who are joining us today and giving up their Saturday mornings to help us dive into the guidelines. Creating the guidelines has been a tremendous endeavor by many, many people from the vasculitis community, as well as the American College of Rheumatology, as you will learn from Dr. Chung's presentation. All of our speakers and moderators are authors on the journal papers. They have been instrumental from day one in helping with the literature review, through writing the articles, reviewing the guidelines, etc. We owe them a great debt of gratitude for all the many hours that they have spent on this multi-year project. I also want to thank the VF staff, Ed Becker, Beth Westbrook, Kaylin Larson, and Shannon Morgan for all their work in helping make this conference a success. They're in the background working away, and I can't say thank you to them enough. We also have two special volunteers today, Tammy Went and Jen Gordon, who are going to be helping with the GCA and EGPA breakout rooms. I also want to thank Amgen, Genentech, GSK, and Sanguine, our sponsors for our 2021 educational conferences for patients. We are grateful for their support. And let's go ahead and get started on today's conference. Our first speaker is Dr. Sharon Chung. She is the director of the Vasculitis Clinic at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Chung is a rheumatologist who specializes in autoimmune diseases, particularly systemic vasculitis, which is a group of rare autoimmune diseases, particularly that affect multiple organ systems and involve blood vessel inflammation. In her research, Dr. Chung studies genetic factors associated with the development and progression of vasculitis and other autoimmune diseases. She was nominated to lead the guidelines project and is going to be providing an overview to help us understand the complexity of developing the guidelines. Dr. Chung, thank you for joining us today. I know it's early in California, so we appreciate you getting up and making time to join us. You have the floor.
So thanks everyone for joining us on a Saturday morning to talk about the 2021 American College of Rheumatology and Vasculitis Foundation Clinical Practice Guidelines for Vasculitis. As Joyce said, my name is Sharon Chung. I'm at the University of California, San Francisco, and it has been my honor to be the chair of the Vasculitis Guidelines Development Committee, I will confess, since 2016. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Let's see if I can, there we go. So I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose for this portion of the program. And I'll just get started with a very fundamental question, which is why should we develop guidelines for vasculitis? For those of us who, spend a lot of our time thinking about vasculitis from the physician aspect, or for those of us who are patients, this makes perfect sense. But for the general community, why should we develop guidelines for the management of vasculitis? The first is because the vasculitides are rare diseases. So outside of an academic medical center, there are many rheumatologists who don't see that many patients with vasculitis in their usual clinical practice. In addition, these are complicated diseases that have the potential to cause a lot of organ damage. And therefore, there is a sense of urgency that we should advance the most appropriate treatment strategy from the beginning to minimize the potential adverse outcomes from these diseases. Thankfully, in the past 10 to 20 years, we've had a number of pivotal randomized clinical trials published, which have broadened the number of treatment options we have available for these diseases. So we're in a situation where diseases are rare, diseases have significant outcomes, and there are treatment possibilities. And so we wanted to produce these guidelines to give practitioners a roadmap on how to treat these diseases and how to navigate these various treatment options. There's also an initiative by the American College of Rheumatology, from which I will refer to as the ACR, and the Vasculitis Foundation to provide healthcare practitioners with evidence-based strategies for management. This is part of a broader initiative by the ACR to provide treatment recommendations for a number of topics, for example, management of rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis. And this initiative has been further advanced by the VF in the realms of vasculitis. The overall goal, is to improve patient care and outcomes. And so all of these factors together have led to this first set of guidelines for vasculitis management. Now, how were these guidelines developed? These guidelines were developed using the GRADE methodology. This is widely accepted to be the gold standard method of developing management guidelines, and it's utilized by a number of organizations across the world. The GRADE methodology involves a number of steps outlined on this slide. So the first is that the scope of the guideline is to be determined. And once the scope is determined, there are questions developed that address relevant clinical situations and questions that should be answered. Once those questions are developed, a literature review is conducted to generate evidence reports summarizing the evidence for each of the questions that were developed. The evidence report is then reviewed by a patient panel and a voting panel. The patient panel provides patient insights regarding the evidence that was summarized in the literature review, and the voting panel takes the evidence report, reviews the evidence, and generates the recommendations. Once the recommendations are generated, a guideline manuscript is written and is subsequently published. And for us, the guideline manuscripts for vasculitis were electronically released in July of this year and formally published in August. I'll go through each of these steps one by one in greater detail. So with regards to the scope of this project, the goal for this project was to develop evidence-based guidelines for the diagnosis, treatment, and management of systemic vasculitis for rheumatologists practicing in the United States. When the American College of Rheumatology first started this effort, they encouraged us to scope broadly. And as a committee, we took that to mean two different things. First, we took that to mean that we should develop guidelines that are applicable to both adults and children. And so each of the recommendations that I present today are relevant to both adults and children. The second was that we took it to mean we should not focus on just one type of vasculitis, but to think about vasculitis broadly. And therefore, we took upon ourselves as a committee to develop recommendations for large vessel vasculitis, medium vessel vasculitis, and small vessel vasculitis. Under large vessel vasculitis, we have focused on giant cell arteritis and Takayasu arteritis. Under medium vessel vasculitis, we have published a guideline for polyarteritis nodosa, and soon we'll be releasing a guideline for Kawasaki disease. And for small vessel vasculitis, we have focused primarily on ANCA-associated vasculitis, looking at GPA, MPA, and eGPA. Once we had the scope of the project defined, the next step was to develop the relevant clinical questions that the guideline would address. Now, the goal was to develop questions that represent clinical situations that patients and practitioners face, such that we could provide guidance on topics that were applicable in routine clinical care. All of the questions were developed in this PICO format, where you specify the patient population, the two treatment options or interventions that were to be compared, and then the outcomes. Now, the intervention and the comparator were to be assessed looking at both disease-related outcomes, such as relapse or death, as well as treatment-related outcomes, such as adverse events. And thus, when you develop a question in a PICO format, it looks like something like this on the right. So in patients with newly diagnosed giant cell arteritis, so that's the patient population we're interested in, what's the impact of oral glucocorticoids, so oral prednisone, with tocilizumab versus prednisone alone? Those are the two interventions that are being compared on disease-related outcomes and treatment-related adverse events. So these are the topics that would be compared for the two comparators, for the two interventions to determine the recommendation. And what I have on the slide here at the bottom are the number of PICO questions that were developed for each of the vasculitides under study. The next step was then to conduct a literature review. So we took these, I believe, 176 PICO questions, had the keywords abstracted for each of these questions, and then conducted a screen with electronic databases cataloging the medical literature to pull out every single published article that may be applicable to the questions that were being asked. And it turned out that there were 13,800 articles identified that could be relevant to our effort. Now, there's no way any human effort could go through all 13,800 articles. And so there was a method employed to review the articles and ensure that we would only focus on the articles that were clearly relevant to the question. So after employing these filtering mechanisms, it turns out that there were 1,156 articles considered for full review for the evidence reports for these 7 types of vasculitis. And with review of these articles, there were 6 evidence reports generated. There was 1 evidence report for combining the studies for GPA and MPA. At the time, this was the largest literature review ever conducted for a guideline effort supported by the American College of Rheumatology. Once we had the evidence report, we convened 2 panels, a patient panel and a voting panel. The patient panel was comprised of 11 patients representing GCA Takayasu's polyarteritis nodosa, GPA, MPA, and EGPA. The patient panel reviewed the evidence report and then provided insight regarding patient preferences for questions regarding treatment, management, and diagnostic testing. So for example, we asked the patient panel for their opinion regarding what medications should be considered first-line therapy for treatment of certain diseases, what their opinions were with regarding topics such as tapering medications, and their opinion for monitoring strategies with laboratory studies or imaging studies. Once the patient panel had provided their insights, we convened a voting panel. This voting panel was comprised of 16 rheumatologists, as well as 2 patients from the patient panel. And for each question, the voting panel reviewed the evidence report, discussed the benefits and harms of the interventions under study, and then voted to determine the direction and the strength of the recommendations. And those recommendations were used to draft the guideline manuscript. Each of our recommendations has the following format. So for patients with blank, we either strongly recommend or conditionally recommend a particular intervention over the comparator. And in order for a recommendation to be included in the manuscript, in the guideline manuscript, the recommendation was required to achieve at least 70% consensus. Now, if you look at the manuscript, we have strong recommendations and conditional recommendations. Strong recommendations indicate that there's a moderate to high quality evidence supporting the recommendation. So, for example, there are multiple randomized trials supporting this recommendation. For strong recommendations, most patients should receive the recommended course of action, and it would be unusual for, limited to a small percentage of patients who would receive the comparator. This is not the same as conditional recommendations. Now, conditional recommendations are supported by lower quality evidence. For example, there might only be one randomized controlled trial, or there might only be observational studies supporting the recommendation. For a conditional recommendation, the majority would likely want the recommended intervention, but the alternative is a reasonable consideration. Now, I'm going to continue to focus on this strong versus conditional status a bit further, because it's really important to understand what it means. So strong and conditional reflects the extent and quality of the published data, of the published evidence. Most recommendations in our guideline manuscripts are conditional because we lack multiple clinical controlled trials addressing the question. Unfortunately, the vasculitides are rare diseases, and so they're not nearly as common as high blood pressure or myocardial infarctions or strokes. And therefore, unlike high blood pressure or myocardial infarctions or strokes, we don't have multiple tens, perhaps more, clinical trials investing a particular question. We may have one or two. And because we don't have that many clinical trials investigating a question, most of our recommendations are conditional. It's important to realize that just because a recommendation is conditional doesn't mean that it's not important. It doesn't mean that it's not critical. It doesn't mean that we don't feel strongly about a recommendation. And I can give you an example here. So this is a recommendation we have for GPA and NPA. So for patients with GPA and NPA who are receiving rituximab or cyclophosphamide, we conditionally recommend prophylaxis to prevent pneumocystis pneumonia. The intervention discussed in this recommendation, prophylaxis for pneumocystis pneumonia, is actually done in all clinical trials involving cyclophosphamide or rituximab in GPA or NPA. It's something that almost all of us vasculitis physicians do recommend for our patients, and it's actually a recommendation that many practitioners feel strongly about. So this is an extremely important recommendation. But the truth of the matter is we don't have any clinical trials examining this intervention. We haven't conducted clinical trials in patients with GPA or NPA where we've randomized patients to receive prophylaxis or not. And because of that, this has to be a conditional recommendation because of the published evidence supporting this recommendation. Now, we also developed ungraded position statements in the guideline manuscripts. And this occurred in the following situation. So let's say we had a PICA question where the evidence for it was not sufficient to support a recommendation or really didn't favor one intervention over another. And this topic was commonly encountered in our clinical practice, and thus we felt it was important to at least address it or acknowledge it in the guideline manuscript. In this situation, we developed ungraded position statements, and they reflect the general views of the voting panel. So one example of an ungraded position statement is here at the bottom, where it says, the optimal duration of therapy with glucocorticoids like prednisone for giant cell arteritis is not well established and should be guided by the patient's values and preferences. I think as physicians, we've all been asked, how long should I stay on prednisone? And I'm sure patients have also asked, how long do I need to be on prednisone? I think this is a question that comes up for almost every patient, no matter what type of vasculitis they have. And the truth of the matter is we really don't have good data indicating how long patients should be on prednisone. And therefore, we wanted to acknowledge this in the guideline manuscript and say, there isn't a set optimal duration, and we really should look to the patient and discuss with the patient what the optimal duration would be. Now, how should we use these recommendations? I think for all of us vasculitis physicians and rheumatologists, our goal is to, when we see patients with active vasculitis, is to treat their vasculitis such that their disease is no longer active. But we often do say each patient with vasculitis has their own type of vasculitis, and therefore they have their own treatment path. We can't address every single, nuance of vasculitis in these guidelines. Instead, our goal for these guidelines is to provide a roadmap for healthcare providers so they have a sense of what treatment options are available for patients with particular types of disease. The goal of the guideline is to also emphasize important factors that should be considered when choosing between two options. And therefore, the treatment selection is really dependent on both the patient and the physician. When you review the guidelines, I don't want you to think, oh my gosh, if I'm not on a particular treatment and therefore I'm being treated inappropriately or something bad is going to happen. That's not necessarily the goal. The goal is really to take a look and see, what the treatment options are and whether or not any of them make sense for you. And also to be able to bring up topics of discussion between you and your healthcare provider to assess, is the treatment path you're on the most appropriate for you given your clinical situation. Now, as we were going through and developing these guidelines, I think we all realized that there were certain areas where we just really didn't have enough evidence to make knowledgeable, informative guidelines. And we identified these as gaps in our knowledge. And in the guideline manuscripts, we bring up these areas, these gaps of knowledge in order to encourage future research in these areas. And so what are these areas? Broadly, across all of the different vasculitides that were understudied, we recognized that we lacked biomarkers that could really indicate disease activity and guide treatment decisions. We really lacked information on how to best use the currently available medications. And what I mean by that is, what is the most appropriate dose? How long should patients be on certain medications? Can we combine certain medications to achieve a better effect? Are there certain groups of patients which would benefit more from a particular medication than others? We really lack that information. And so we really want to encourage trials to further clarify these questions so we can provide more nuanced recommendations in the future. We also want to encourage the development of novel, more targeted therapies or glucocorticoid-sparing therapies to minimize toxicity for our patients. And we also want to encourage long-term studies to really understand the course of our diseases and the safety of our current therapies. So, for example, what is the impact of continuing with therapy beyond 18 to 24 months that's currently studied? So where do we go from here? So right now, we are at the top of this cycle where we've had the publication of the first guideline manuscripts for the 7 vasculitides under study. The hope is that, in the coming years, there will be additional studies conducted such that it provides more nuanced information for the questions that we have previously asked, or leads to the development of more questions, new questions to be answered. Once, a sufficient, a number of studies, or, once, a sufficient number of new questions have been identified, the goal would be to reinitiate this guideline development process to conduct another literature review such that we can update the guidelines that have been published. And the hope is that this will be a continuously updating process such that we will have nuanced recommendations for our patients in the future. Now, my name has been associated with these guidelines, but I would be the first to admit that this has been a group effort. And I would like to recognize the core team supporting the vasculitis guidelines development effort. A lot of these individuals are actually at the conference today, but this is the group that has done the heavy lifting from developing the questions all the way to writing the manuscripts for publication. So thank you very much for the core team. In addition to the core team, this has truly been, a village effort, and with the sheer number of individuals who've been involved in supporting this. So I'd like to recognize the two voting panels that were convened to develop the recommendations, the literature review team, which truly had a Herculean effort going through the published literature for these 7 different types of vasculitis, the patient panel, who provided invaluable insights into patient preferences and opinions regarding potential recommendations, and our expert panel who helped us in the scoping process. This effort would not be possible without the support from the American College of Rheumatology and their staff. And in addition, we really need to acknowledge the support provided by the Vasculitis Foundation and our own Joyce Coleman, for whom this effort, as well as this conference and many other efforts in vasculitis, would not occur. So thank you, everyone who has contributed to this effort.
Sasha.
And with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I am happy to take questions.